Hi, everyone. Can you hear me pretty well? I'm Marianne Smart, professor in the music department here, and I'm our moderator this afternoon for the third panel in the On the Same Page program focused on the musical Hamilton. You all know that. That's why you're here. Our topic this afternoon is Hamilton in and out of the White House. And there's all kinds of implications to that title. It was devised from the beginning to be kind of ironic, kind of counterfactual and problematic. And each of the speakers will have their own take on what Hamilton, the historical figure, and Hamilton, the show, might have to do with the White House then and now. The format that we're working with this afternoon is short remarks by each of the speakers independently from up here, and then we'll convene behind our place cards there for a little bit of discussion among the panel, and then we're going to fairly quickly turn out to you for questions, suggestions, controversial remarks that we'd love to take up and hear about. So for now, I'm just going to quickly introduce our three speakers. I'm so grateful to have all of you here, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say in the discussion. First, we'll hear from Donatella Galella, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Theater, Film, and Digital Production at University of California, Riverside. She works on musical theater in contemporary American culture with a particular focus on Asian American performance. She's the author of an article on a musical adaptation of Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun that came out in a journal of African diaspora theater and performance this year, and an article on a multiracial production of Rodgers and Hammerstein's show Oklahoma in Theater Journal. Her longer-term project right now is a book on a company called Arena Stage, based in Washington, D.C., and their engagements with considerations of profit, race, and American identity. Another current project focuses on yellowface, modern manifestations of yellowface in American musicals. And she's also, as she mentioned over lunch, currently expanding an influential, much commented on review that she wrote of Hamilton that came out in The Advocate, I think in 2015, under the title Racializing the American Revolution. So she's building that out into a full-length article, and I hope she'll give us some samples of that work this afternoon. Professor Galella also works as a dramaturg, most consistently with Leviathan Lab, a New York-based Asian American creative studio. Our second speaker from Berkeley, from the Department of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies, is Kan Gotanda, who teaches playwriting here and is also a distinguished playwright. Through his plays and advocacy, Professor Gotanda has been instrumental in bringing stories of Asians in the United States to mainstream American theater. And his distinguished performances and works are far too many to mention here. I'll just touch on a few. The play Yankee Dog, You Die, first seen in the late 1980s, has attained the status of a classic and was recently revived in San Jose with George Takei in one of the principal roles. Other plays that have been seen here in San Francisco at American Conservatory Theater and elsewhere include After the War Blues, I Dream of Chang and Eng, which was received a prominent and very well-regarded premiere in Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies here a couple of years ago. Yo Hen, again premiered at American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco and currently being remounted in Los Angeles by East West Players in a performance featuring Danny Glover. And I'll just put in a little sort of ad spot. I discovered in reacquainting myself with Professor Gotanda's career that his play, The Dream of Kitamura, is slated for performance at Zellerbach Playhouse this spring. That's right, isn't it? In April. So without even leaving campus, you can see one of his performances. Professor Gotanda has also worked in musical theater, in creation of, I should say, in writing for musical theater, opera, dance, and independent film, including work on a film that was shown at Sundance Film Festival a few years ago. And last but not least, as we say much too often, our third speaker is Philip Gentry, who's an assistant professor of music history at the University of Delaware. His work centers on music and politics in the United States in the 20th century, with a special focus on the 1950s. He's published on Leonard Bernstein, John Cage, and his book, titled What Will I Be? American Music and Cold War Identity, is coming out, he said, in a couple of weeks from Oxford University Press. So let's welcome these three speakers. And can I ask Donatella to come up and start things off? Thank you.
Good afternoon, and my warm thanks to Professor Smart, Alex Schwartz, and the Hamilton Committee for hosting me today. My title is Hamilton and Obama, We Get the Job Done. When Lafayette and Hamilton team up for the Battle of Yorktown, they say together, "Immigrants, we get the job done." A line that typically sparks applause and cheers to the extent that Lin-Manuel Miranda had to write in an additional beat. In my remarks, I want to take seriously the politics of what is this job, the work that Hamilton performed in the context of the age of Obama. Obama's tenure as president from 2009 to 2016 approximates the period when Miranda developed and debuted this musical. Both of these men share many similarities, but my focus today is going to be on how people of color, especially immigrants, can take center stage only when they celebrate entrepreneurialism and embody the exceptional. And then their exceptionalism becomes proof of how barriers can be overcome easily, as if racial difference no longer matters. I contend that Hamilton and Obama largely emphasize hard work, extraordinariness, and patriotism, rather than grappling with the uneven ground on which people stand. In my conclusion, I looked at how the musical has embodied resistance to Donald Trump, yet in still limited ways. So by electing Barack Obama in 2008, the United States appeared to have dismantled racial hierarchy. And Obama contributed to this happy narrative with his rhetoric that largely downplayed the continued salience of race and racism. So one small example, in 2013, he addressed the graduates of the historically black college, Morehouse College, and he both acknowledged the existence of discrimination, yet he urged, quote, "Nobody cares if you suffered some discrimination, and we've got no time for excuses." So he qualifies structural oppression with the words if and some, and he insinuated that achieving goals is only a matter of desire. He pronounced also, quote, "It is important for all of us, black, white, and brown, to advocate for an America where everybody has got a fair shot in life." I want to remind you that during his time in office, economic disparities between black and white Americans have increased, and police officers and vigilantes have received more attention for disproportionately killing unarmed black people. President Obama then became a spokesman of sorts for Hamilton because of the similar representational and political work that both of them do. At the White House in 2009, Miranda performed what would become the opening of Hamilton. The racial diversity of the original cast has resonated with Obama as the first US president of color, to the point that Ron Chernow and others have said that the cast reflects, quote, "Obama's America." Since the musical opened, Obama has seen the production multiple times and even hosted the cast at the White House, where they performed Alexander Hamilton and My Shot, the songs in Hamilton that I think best embody the bootstraps ethos, the idea like, oh, if I just work really hard, then I'll be successful. At the 2016 Tony Awards, Barack and Michelle Obama introduced the company of Hamilton by invoking American platitudes of everyone having a chance to succeed if they just work hard in this nation, which was, quote, "a place of opportunity where no matter how humble our origins, we can make it if we try." This pervasive belief in colorblind meritocracy and disavowal of systemic racism ignores fundamental structural truths about the country, and it does real harm. Obama and Miranda share not only this kind of language, but also policy proposals for governments to serve business interests. In 2012, Obama issued the Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals, DACA, policy via executive order. And this suspended deportations of undocumented immigrants who arrived to the United States as children and provided work permits if they met certain qualifications, like you must have committed no crimes. An anti-racist initiative, DACA covers immigrants mostly of Latinx and Asian heritage. But the policy heavily relies upon arguments that undocumented people benefit the US economy in their entrepreneurship and their exploitation as human capital. Surely, when audience cheer at the line, "Immigrants, we get the job done," they express pro-immigrant sentiment, whereas many US Americans support building a wall along the Mexican border and rejecting all Muslim immigrants and refugees. But at the same time, I want to acknowledge that this ovation specifically and contingently rests upon the labor that immigrants perform as proving them worthy. In addition, in 2016, Obama and Miranda endorsed the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, also known as PROMESA, which provided funds for the deeply indebted colonized island at the cost of a non-elected American Enterprise Institute Review Board and the removal of the minimum wage for several lines of work in Puerto Rico. The multiracial casting of Hamilton works in tandem with the bootstraps narrative that's at the heart of Hamilton. In the opening lines, Aaron Burr asks, how did Alexander Hamilton become a hero and a scholar, given his impoverished, orphaned origins in the Caribbean? We immediately learn the answer in the next verse, quote, "The $10 founding father without a father got a lot farther by working a lot harder, by being a lot smarter, by being a self-starter. By 14, they placed him in charge of a trading charter." So in these lyrics, they obliquely reference how immigrants must hustle more than US-born citizens, even as Miranda is celebrating the tenets of entrepreneurialism that links diligence with intelligence and therefore deservingness. But this ideology downplays structural obstacles and implicitly blames poor people for their own poverty. The proffered solution is work harder and be smarter, not, hey, let's redistribute some resources equitably. In the stage number My Shot, Hamilton introduces himself, quote, "I shoulder every burden, every disadvantage I have learned to manage," stressing his hardships, but none of this names racism, as the actor's racialized body performs that labor. To put this another way, the musical rarely discusses overt white supremacy and instead relies on the embodiment of the actors of color to do the talking, and this is much like the strategy that Obama employed during his presidency. In the refrain, Hamilton sings, "I am not throwing away my shot," as more and more performers, mostly of color, join him. He stands his ground, feet shoulder-width apart, then extending out his hand and resting a hand on his heart in a patriotic gesture. With this grounded movement and harmonious singing, as each performer takes up an equal amount of space, but with Hamilton center stage, the staging demonstrates a belief that everyone has a shot with which to begin. When many Americans believe this credo of equal opportunity, they rationalize that those at the top and those at the bottom have earned their respective places. The links between Hamilton, Obama, and immigrants have intensified after the election of, and largely in opposition to, Trump. Because the center of the political dial moved right, the relative positionality of the musical went leftward. After Obama, when an outright white supremacist killed an anti-racist protester in Charlottesville, the new president could dub Nazis and KKK members very fine people, and 11% of Americans openly agreed with this sentiment when polled. In this context, Hamilton has come to symbolize an unapologetic vision of the nation as righteously, racially diverse. When Vice President-elect Mike Pence attended Hamilton on November 18, 2016, which was just a week after the election, Broadway audience members booed him. But I also want to emphasize that at the same time, other people in the audience cheered for him. And this was rarely discussed in the media. And I think it's really important to know that most Republicans also love Hamilton, and we need to grapple with why that is the case. And news stories therefore emphasize the curtain speech that actor Brandon Victor Dixon, who's Black American and who played Burr in the production, delivered to Pence at this performance. And I'll play that clip for you now.
We have a message for you, sir. We hope that you will hear us out. And I encourage everybody to pull out your phones and tweet and post, because this message needs to be spread far and wide, okay? Vice President-elect Pence, we welcome you, and we truly thank you for joining us here at Hamilton, an American Musical. We really do. We, sir, we are the diverse America who are alarmed and anxious that your new administration will not protect us, our planet, our children, our parents, or defend us and uphold our inalienable rights, sir. But we truly hope that this show has inspired you to uphold our American values and to work on behalf of all of us. All of us.
All right. This speech was composed by Miranda, the producers, and the cast, and it expressed sincere concern for future attacks upon minoritized people. The diction obliquely referenced, yet did not name, the Trump administration's threats to deport undocumented people, build a border wall, ban Muslims, prohibit abortion, and compel LGBTQ people into electroshock therapy. Calling Pence "Sir" twice, Dixon showed deference for the vice president-elect. His invocation of American values implicitly identified such values as equality and diversity, rather than the white supremacy and capitalism that have undergirded this nation. Emblematic of Hamilton itself, this centrist liberal plea to nationalism, tolerance, and respectability politics, instead of bluntly naming real threats and urging, "Do not kill us." So what I'm trying to suggest is, let's look at the language here and what they said and what they could have said instead, but chose not to. In response to the milquetoast oration, Trump blasted the artists behind Hamilton because they harassed Pence, and some Republicans called for a boycott of the musical. In the end, Pence, who I'd argue is a Cheney-esque Republican establishment figure, said that he liked the musical, and it did not appear to make him uncomfortable, and the speech did not seem to make him endorse policies for material equality. And so, in this new context of more anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies, the resistance has really taken up Hamilton. We know that the music video for Immigrants We Get the Job Done from the Hamilton mixtape won the 2017 MTV Video Music Award for Best Fight Against the System. At the post-inauguration Women's March and 2017 May Day rallies across the nation, protesters held signs proclaiming "Immigrants, we get the job done." They took pride in immigrants and in Salute and in Hamilton and as the art of immigrants, staking a claim to their belonging in the United States. Indexing the age of Obama, the musical re-articulated Americanness as racial diversity. And I'd say that although this counter-narrative is extremely important for its inclusion work, we need to remember that it demands that immigrants gain entrance to the United States only if they comply with capitalist dictates and pretend that structural racism does not exist. Getting the job done is the price of admission to the room where it happens. But what if admission were free? Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to snag my water. Is this mine?
Yes.
Let's see. I also have a computer up here, but maybe, whether I'm going to plug in or not, I'm not sure. It requires a certain amount of technical facility that I don't know if I have when I'm up here. So first off, I'd like to thank Mary and Alex and the Hamilton Committee for inviting me here, and also to be appreciative of my fellow panelists, companion panelists rather. And what I would like to do is talk about Hamilton in the White House, out of the White House, from the point of view of a playwright. I'm a working playwright, so I thought I would talk about my feelings about seeing the piece, and then subsequent to that, I'm also going to talk about Pence, and then also Trump's tweet, in which he said to apologize. And then subsequent to that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the playwright's responsibility, or what a playwright or artist will do to respond to the situation that we have in this Trumpian era. I realize I'm mobile. When I first went online to look at the variety of things that deal with Hamilton and the White House, I was rather amazed at how many things are there. I think if any of you have looked at it, you can see all the discussions about Pence, you know, the variety of shows that took it up. And also you'll see Lin-Manuel Miranda do the first presentation of Hamilton, and it's in 2009 actually, and it's one where he's been invited to do a spoken word poetry evening. And what he decides to do instead is to debut this new thing he's working on. And so he says, I have only about 11 lines, and that he's going to perform them, and so he does. And one of the things he does initially is to say, I've written this new musical, because he was known for In the Heights, you know, about Alexander Hamilton. And then everyone laughs, and he says, don't laugh. And then he kind of goes into this introduction, and then he does the performance of it. What I felt about that performance as I watched it, what I felt about the other performances with the entire cast in the White House, what I felt when I saw this other video of Obama and Lin-Manuel Miranda together, in which Obama feeds Miranda words to adjust in a rap. And I thought, this is so interesting, and that what I feel is, I feel I'm home. I look at the world, I watch the people, I look at the president, I look at the White House, I listen to the music, and I feel comfort. I feel home. I feel that there is this trajectory that I have lived, and that I believe, and that is inevitable, and that is, all things considered, ultimately we're heading towards this world where, you know, it is inclusive, it doesn't suffer from racism, there's equality, there is rightness, and that we're always moving in that direction. And I believe that my entire adult life, that no matter what was going on, all the struggle had to do with moving in that direction. Well, Trump was elected, and representative of that was this moment where Trump tweeted to the cast of Hamilton after they had spoken to Vice President-elect Pence, apologize. You know, I had it on my computer, but I'll enact it. Apologize. And when I read that initially, I thought, my gut responded in a way which said, this is wrong. Something about this is not right about this picture. And it began to take shape in that this was an interruption of my whole body and being's belief that we were on this trajectory, that no matter what was going on, we were gradually going to reach a point where, you know, we eradicated racism, you know, there would be an equality of all peoples. I believe that was where we were heading. But with that line, apologize, it made me think, this is disrupting that narrative that I believed my entire life, and that in fact maybe this is not the case what I believed, and that there can be disruptions, and that the course of one's life, a course of society, can alter and change. What I felt when he said apologize, it was, you are wrong. I am right. I occupy the center. I occupy all the institutions, and I am right, and you are wrong. And that was something I just wasn't accustomed, because I believed that we were at least moving forward, and that I was now beginning to participate and be a part of the center, certainly in terms of American theater. And Hamilton does that. You watch it and you think, oh, this is inclusive. You know, I am sharing the center. I am telling a version of the story, of the history that is coming from my point of view. With Trump and that mention of apologize, for me it meant this is not the world that I had grown to sort of feel was the path, but in fact was something else. And that someone else believed they occupied the center, reoccupied it without me, and that I was wrong. There was a wrongness to what I felt and believed. That affected me a great deal, and has continued to, as I've tracked through the Trumpian administration, to continue to feel this sort of inability to understand what is going on, given the narrative I had lived with. Which leads me to this idea of, you have the piece like Hamilton. I watched it. I felt as if I were home. I felt comfortable with it. This was the world that I see and live and envision. And then to get that displaced. And how do I, as a playwright, engage, contend with the changing world? And so for myself, again, I'm a playwright. So in the only way I know how, I started working on a new play with a local theater called Theater Ubuntu. They're a progressive young theater in Oakland. And we decided to do a variation of an adaptation of Rashomon. And if you know the movie and the play that was based on the movie, it's about different perceptions of what is truth. There is a crime that's committed, and all the various participants have a different version of the truth. And the artistic director, Michael Moran, and I thought this might be a good thing, that we can perhaps begin to grapple with what is going on in the world that we don't understand. You know, the idea that what is truth? Why is it that if you lie and lie loud enough and you have enough bells and whistles and your spectacle is louder than someone else's, then it becomes a truth? Why is it that segments of the populace will believe the lie? You know, what happened to my truth? All of these questions sort of like hovered around us, and we began to try to write a play that contended with that. And we pulled from a lot of different articles in the Times and gave those lines to one of the characters in the play, who commented on the story as it evolved, where different people were saying different things and describing the incident from their point of view. And so the character will say, one of the characters will say that, you know, there's a truth that we all share. Kind of a postmodern idea that the way this all works is that everyone has a point of view, and everyone has a piece of the truth, and we all share the truth. And so that allows the system to continue to be in balance. But what happens when someone comes along and refuses to acknowledge your truth? In fact, says everything about what you say is a lie, then what does that do to the whole balance of the system? There's another factor, and I'm going to seem as if I'm rambling a bit, but we were trying to figure out ways, again, how to contend with this Trumpian era through theater in a play, and trying to figure out how to understand the world that we live in, where it's hard to get a sense of truth, lies that become truth. And And one of the interesting things we came across, and we talked about this at lunchtime, was this concept of KFOB. And KFOB is a term to describe professional wrestling. And what it is, and I thought it was kind of very interesting, that in professional wrestling, KFOB, it describes the fact that you know that in fact it's all fake, and yet you go, you cheer, you're invested in all the people, and you get a emotional satisfaction, even though you know in fact it's not true. And we begin to think about that in relationship to some of the segments of America and in relationship to Trump. The idea that emotional truth ultimately is more gratifying and satisfying than factual truth. And that, in fact, in the face of seemingly obvious fact, you are willing to go with emotional truth because it makes you feel better. We took a variety of things and put them into the play. Again, in hopes of being able to see how does one grapple in this Trumpian era with theater, with a play that no longer allows me to look at the White House and think of my participation as being part of the story, being a participant in the telling, being a participant in the center, as opposed to pushed to the margins. You know, I think it's part of, at least for myself, that was the response I had to the work. And the last thing I will say is another thing I came across, and again I thought of as I heard, you know, I thought about what to say at this panel, was there Harold Pinter in his Nobel Prize speech talked about the idea of the artist. And he talked about the idea of how, as an artist, Pinter said, I can contend with ambiguity. Ambiguity is where I live as an artist and as a writer. But he said there's also the hat you have to wear, which is the hat of the citizen. And for the citizen, there has to be a clear distinction. You can't accept this ambiguity, and that there is right and that there is wrong. And so I kind of thought about that in relationship to the work that I've been doing, and then certainly in terms of the work of Lin-Manuel Miranda and Hamilton and its impact on the world, that, you know, you can both look at it in an artful way, but you can never not look at it with your citizen's hat on. That there is art, there's ambiguity, but at least in my point of view, you have to wear the hat of a citizen, which also says there are also distinctions. Now, how they dovetail together, I'm not quite sure, but they both make sense to me in terms of viewing the world and being an artist and looking at something like Hamilton that is, I would say, it's an extraordinary work in and of itself. It's you know, rather amazing in terms of its artfulness, its craft, and certainly the collective team of artists, you know, actors, performers, composers, choreographers. I also acknowledge what Donatella was saying too. All of that's, you know, very appropriate. You know, there are also critiques about Hamilton in that it didn't really deal with the idea of slavery. And Hamilton's white family had a lot of slaves. And so there are certain issues around Hamilton that should be addressed. And given that, it's also, I find it to be rather extraordinary work in terms of its vision of inclusivity, the cast, the picture, how it redefines what America is and how it was founded. And that is it. Thank you.
And thank you so much for the invitation. Donatella and Philip I think I've said most of the smart things that we can sort of say at this point in time, so I'll just try to wrap up to a certain extent. When I think of Hamilton these days, I feel tired. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if you feel tired. I feel tired in general. I feel tired that it's late in the semester and that there's lots going on. I've felt a certain sense of exhaustion for almost exactly a year now, frankly. A constant sense of being tired. And in an interesting way, I can't separate Hamilton from that exhaustion for me. I was asked to write an essay about Hamilton in the summer of 2016, and I was thrilled to have that opportunity because I loved Hamilton so much. I'd been following it ever since the 2009 performance at the White House. I'd seen it, I had obsessed over the soundtrack like everybody did until I could see it. I had a very close relationship with Hamilton. And in the summer of 2016, it really felt like it spoke to a new way that perhaps a very commercial art form could do something politically that I found really powerful. And I don't know if you remember the summer of 2016, but at that point in time, the biggest debate for many people, at least in my political position, had to do with what sort of politics should we be operating at that moment in time. And it spilled into lots of venues, but I think very especially if you recall back to the Democratic primary of that spring, the famous Clinton versus Sanders situation, which for many people boiled down, and this is not necessarily a fair boiling down, but nevertheless was a division between what many people called a form of identity politics versus a more class-based politics. I don't think that's fair necessarily, but that was something you saw a lot of discussion around. And amongst that debate, Hamilton very much stood in for the Clinton campaign. And famously, the Hamilton production actually did a benefit performance for the Hillary Clinton campaign. And there was many senses in this sort of alighting over the Obama into Clinton presidencies that the sort of representational politics that Donatella was speaking of would merge smoothly into the Clinton presidency, and we'd have this amazing unmatched stretch of 16 years of a sort of aspirational liberal idealism that was going to be very powerful. And although myself was further to the left on many of those questions, I couldn't help but be swept up a little bit in that sort of narrative. And then came the hurricane, right? And I suspect it felt like a bit of a hurricane, and even, I don't know where we all stand politically, but even for perhaps Trump supporters as well, there was that strange couple months between November and January when we were all in such this very hesitant, for some people fearful, I guess for some people probably optimistic, space where we didn't quite know what was happening. We had that eye of the hurricane moment, and Hamilton was exactly wrong for me at that moment. I had gotten this assignment to write that essay. It was due in January. It was actually literally due on Inauguration Day. And there was nothing I less wanted to write about than Hamilton, because it seemed to no longer speak to what was happening for me, and I suspected for many other people as well. And so I want to think through a little bit more of like those feelings and those sort of politics that Hamilton was operating on, and why they succeeded in some cases and why they didn't in others. I think one of the special things about Hamilton is indeed its embrace of identity politics. And I just want to make clear what I mean when I say identity politics, because although the Democratic primary might be long over, that issue of what is the place of identity politics in the future of the left and the right, for that matter, is still obviously it's something we're all thinking a lot about these days. And the crucial thing for me is the idea that identity is a fairly recent conception we have, and the politics that go along with it are actually somewhat recent. Identity as a term was not popularized until the 1950s. The idea of who you are, how you decide like what sort of person you are and what drives you. We've had lots of other ways of thinking about that. If you think of ideas of like a soul or your character, or especially in a lot of the 20th century, a much more biological view of your physiological determining what you are, the shape of your brain, and of course ideas of race. And identity came along in the 1950s, and it replaced all of that with psychology. This idea that we're going to sort of have a a sense of who we are that certainly comes out of our childhood and our development, and it's a complicated sense. One of the things I think we often get wrong about identity politics is it gets kind of almost, it becomes a parody of itself, that it means you're just focusing on race or sexuality or something like that. But identity, of course, means the fullness of who you are in relationship to other groups, but it really is a full sense of who you are. It's sort of about having a sense of yourself separate from everyone else. It's where we get the rhetoric of, say, coming out, right? Which emerges in the 1950s as well. The idea that I have an authentic self inside and I'm trying to figure out the best way to do it publicly. That is identity, and it sparked new formulations of politics. That's why it's one of the reasons, or it's the same energy that gives rise to all the great political social movements of the 1950s and 60s, right? The civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, the early women's movement, things like that. And this powerful thing called identity politics often gets seen as taking over from older forms of class-based whatever, the labor movement, things like that. But it's incredibly effective. And when I always have to sort of boil identity politics down, the thing I always want to say about it is that it's a strategy. I don't think anybody actually sees it as the end game. It's not what you're trying to achieve. It's the tools, and I'd say identity itself is that tool. And I think Hamilton might be the apotheosis of that idea of identity politics. It's the sense that it wants to, I think it's more than just representation. It wants you to feel differently. And to give credit to the musical, it does an extraordinary job of making you feel. I think we often, myself included, get very caught up on some of the more sort of famous and quotable numbers, the rap battles, the opening numbers, things like that. But when I saw Hamilton, what I brought home was often the much more quiet, intimate moments, say the death of Philip Schuyler, the forgiveness moment, right, in the second act. These moments where you have a deep sense of connection and you feel a sense of belonging. And I've seen over and over again in many sort of ethnographic contexts how many people feel this special sense of belonging, which for so long when it came to ideas of nationalism was kept separate from many people who are in this country. And so that's very powerful, that kind of identity politics. But then comes the hurricane, and we seem a little adrift in terms of where are we going to take that energy. It's easy to think of Hamilton, and many people complain for its high ticket prices and things like that, and I think rightfully complain about the way Miranda has commodified certain aspects of it and things like that. But when we move into the future, I'm mostly going to leave this as an open-ended question that I don't know what the place of Hamilton is anymore. The optimistic part of me sees that many people on the left, which is where my attitude is here, are embracing a more robust kind of politics that is both identity politics but also thinks very carefully about more systematic structural things. And it's been heartening to see that, again, from my perspective, everywhere from the centers of the Democratic Party but also to the more left as well, has really been embracing a sort of more rich, robust version of these politics. And so I actually mostly want to leave this, not that you need to answer me in this moment, but as for us to think about is Hamilton seemed for a moment like it would be powerful and could do something, not just represent politics or make a didactic argument, but could actually accomplish something. And in this moment, I don't know what it accomplishes, and I want it to accomplish something because I love it so much. And I want to believe that a mass cultural commercial spectacle like this can do something. And I'm not sure what that is right now because I'm tired, and I'm not sure what it apparently was not enough from my perspective in 2016. And I hope that it has something more to offer in the future, but I'm going to leave that as an open-ended question. Thank you.
Thanks so much, all three of you. Those were very wide-ranging, stimulating comments, and also fun. not entirely cheery, but so I'm left with, well, Phil, you left us with the kind of the only questions that really matter there at the end. In some ways, we could just go with those. What did Hamilton accomplish, if anything? What does it now look like Hamilton accomplished? The larger question, even larger question for me, before hearing you all this afternoon, and then again now having heard the specifics of what you have to say, is what is even possible in the realm of political art? Phil Gentry said towards the end, you said you want to believe that it's possible for a widely popular cultural work to be able to change things. That's been the core aspect of my engagement with the show, and frankly with pretty much all of my work in my career, is thinking, artworks matter politically. My job is to figure out how they matter, or to show that they matter in ways that might not be obvious. So Hamilton is both exciting and also frustrating in that way. I think Philip Gotanda, by especially the citation of Pinter towards the end of your remarks, seemed to me to also speak to that, and to in a way answer or complement what Donatella was saying about the limited sphere in which Hamilton makes an intervention politically. Hearing Pinter quoted almost in sort of within the same frame as your really pertinent comments about the kind of blindered view of immigration and the value of the immigrant that the show puts across, made me start thinking about what are the limitations and what are the spheres of art and advocacy. Should they always come together? Obviously not for every artist or every scholar, but is there a place where they should come together, or do they always need to be kept separate? As Pinter seemed to be suggesting, in a way, that there's a place for advocacy, and a lot of scholars I think would say that as well, that there's political work, and then there's the work that you do in research or engaging with the arts. I might bring up two final aspects, and then I promise I'll turn this into a real question for all of you. Two final general things that sort of formed up for me as questions listening to the comments were the question of audience and market. The Broadway musical is a special kind of artwork, and that's a huge part of the reason that we're here talking about Hamilton. We probably wouldn't be if it was a certain kind of Hollywood movie. It might not get the same. It might not command the same kind of prestige that Hamilton has. If it was an independent theatrical work, it wouldn't command the same kind of attention, the same kind of multiple engagements and reactions that it has. But that also comes with a whole set of limitations about the audience that you're addressing and the kinds of things that you can say. So is there a kind of linguistic constraint that comes along with being on Broadway that maybe has to factor into our thinking about the show? The idea of strategic speech came to mind at some points, thinking about that question. And then finally, we've talked today mostly about what the show says or represents. So in terms of plot, types of characters, to some extent casting and the actual people playing the roles, although everything by necessity went by very quickly. We haven't talked much about how it sounds or what it shows. So I thought that might be something we might bring into the conversation at this point, and specifically whether some of what's said that I think all of you seem to agree explicitly or implicitly that there's a kind of middle of the road sort of soft liberal politics being articulated within the book. And those are some of the things that has allowed it to have the legs that it's had publicly and on social media and all that. But when you think about what it sounds like or what it shows, are there different and maybe more exciting dimensions of it, more politically exciting dimensions? Okay, so I promised that I would turn this into a question. And the question is, what can we hope for from political art? What can art do, and what are the best, in each of your opinions, from each of your distinct perspectives, what are the best sort of avenues of communication, audience, genre, venue, where art can actually make a difference to political realities? Feel free to take up any or no aspects of these questions. But
I have a thought, because I was listening to Phil and Donatella, and not to put a damper on everything, but I work in theater, and I've been in theater for 40-something years, and my expectation is not that any play is going to change the world. And certainly, as fun and good and entertaining as Hamilton was, there is this moment of, after its first, bask there, you step back, and it's fine. But to me, the things that that stood out at the time are also things that have been done off Broadway for a long time in terms of the casting and all of that. It's not new at all. Again, not to diminish that. So for me, it was fine, and it had a mass message. I'm glad that it was kind of embraced by the Obamas, and it provides a good jumping off point. But I do think personally, it is what it is. But the expectation that we should spend time discussing it and that it changes, the world and anything along those lines, to me, again, personally, I don't know if it's quite worthy of that. There are other things that have come along that I think, in terms of theater, even me talking about Pinter, he's not American and never overtly political, but there's something about his work to me that lasts, sustains itself, and allows for the continuation of argument and engagement. Angels in America is coming back. That's a piece that I felt really impacted culturally, and that at its core, what it invited was a very, I think, intense intellectual discussion, and that the people involved in it also were highly provocative. Tony Kushner is a very provocative person. Not to diminish, again, Lin-Manuel Miranda, who's obviously brilliant in what he does. But for me personally, again, there are other works that I think have had more impact, and that is my own take on the piece.
I'm with you, and first I'll play the feminist killjoy, which is my favorite role, and then I'll play the cockeyed optimist. And also, if you're tweeting, I hope you're using # Alexander Panelton.
Bravo.
Thank you. So first, I agree with Phil, and I'll share that when I first saw Hamilton at the Public Theater, I had never experienced such a smug white audience in my life. It was very self-congratulatory, and it was really gross to me, even as I longed to be part of the United States, and I wanted to feel the same way that they were feeling, but I didn't. So I wanted to share that, and I'm really cynical about what kind of impact theater can have on the world. I think a lot of people thought when 4 Black actors won all of the Tony Awards for acting, like, oh, huzzah, we've solved racism at the Tonys, this will be changed forever. It did not. If you paid attention to the Tonys last year, only white people got awards, except for Mimi Leanne for the set design of Natasha Pierre and Comet of 1812, and Jitney by August Wilson got Best Revival. That was it. And Allegiance closed because no one wants to see a musical about interning Japanese Americans, and Shuffle Along closed, and Color Purple is closed. So there was no trend that was happening here. That's not supported by data. I also don't think theater gets people even to vote. much less stage the revolution in real life to overthrow power structures. On the other hand, I think that theater allows us to do this thing that Jill Dillon, who's a feminist theater critic, she calls it utopian performatives. So the idea that we can use theater to imagine new kinds of realities and the way that the world should be. And we can't make it happen in the real world unless we can envision it and then stage it in a theater space and then witness it together as a community. So I think that theater has the ability to build that fictional world, and then we can try to make that real and tangible. I think it can teach people, I think it can make people feel in certain ways, and I think it can build community. So it has this potential, but it has all of these other structural limitations as well.
I think the one brief thing I can say of that, in addition to agreeing with both these things, it's, there's social movement theory that goes into like, how do you maintain social movements? And like one of the functions music often plays in those theories is sort of as cheerleader, that for the already motivated, it's an encouragement to keep being motivated. It's a sense of community and things like that. And obviously Hamilton played that role for many people. Yeah, the one thing that is, for me, is a little special about Hamilton is the 18th century subject matter. Not that that's at all unusual. We've had plenty of Broadway musicals about the 18th century, or other historical musicals and things like that. But the 18th century is, it is our deep, it's a deep-rooted thing in our political life. And if I think of the specters of constitutional originalism, or the Tea Party movement, or I live in Philadelphia, where we're surrounded by Independence Hall that's been carved into these really grotesque, weird 1950s things to sort of like, if you've ever been to Philly, Independence Hall they bulldozed everything around it to give it sort of like a sort of Soviet-style approach. So you see this like, you feel like you could march troops up to it if you needed to, but it's actually really small. Independence Hall is tiny, and so when they tore all the buildings down around it, it actually makes it look insignificant. It's just like this funny little brick building surrounded by big Soviet lawns, and that. What we do with the 18th century in our political life is really fraught, and of course has nothing to do with the actual 18th century any more than we like actually care about the Constitution or anything like that. We sort of speak through the 18th century very specifically. So there's something powerful about Hamilton attacking that to a certain extent, but again, the cynical part for me is that actually what it did is it just reinscribed all our sort of like romantic ideas about that stuff. And kept the nation state intact, for better or for worse, and all those sorts of things, and ignored the question of slavery. It's used to criticize Jefferson, but Washington's slaveriness is never talked about. Several of us have mentioned the heteronormativity, the gender roles, those sort of things in Hamilton are really fraught. So yeah, I sort of wish it was more deconstructive about it, but there was some possibility there that I found maybe potentially powerful.
Seems very dark.
Such good music, though.
We're tired.
Yeah, we're all tired.
Yeah,
We
I
have to
get
sing along.
that. I feel that. But at the same time, there's, first of all, no show can do everything. What about, I love Pinter. I've loved Pinter since I was an undergraduate and first heard his name. But Pinter is not going to he's never going to reach the people that Hamilton reaches.
That's true.
Nor show the kinds of things. Well, Pinter, the issues, they're so British. That's partly a difficult interface. But I think, I don't know. The mainstream appeal of Hamilton is part of what gives it the potential, the kind of the sheen of excitement. And I definitely did not come here looking to be cast as an opponent to all three of you, or arguing in favor of Hamilton. But that's what we do, right, professors? We just sort of take whatever the consensus in the room is. We sort of strategically occupy the opposite position for a while, so I can't stop myself. From asking things like this argument that you made, Donatella, about the bootstrap narrative and the emphasis on labor, immigrant labor, is totally right on the mark. It's irresistible. The logic of that is brilliant. But it makes me think, for the older people here will maybe recognize this. One of the things that made me think of was the way we sometimes talk about the value of the University of California to the state of California, which is in terms of, in sort of, faculty discussions, often framed in terms of California brings something to the economy of the state. And the idea of that is not that that's all we believe that we do that's of value, but that there are some interlocutors that we need to reach who will only hear arguments that are framed in terms of economics and labor. And if they hear about the workforce and generating capital, that will count, whereas ideas won't count. So that's one frame within which maybe this, in many ways, compromised show could be saying things that no other show could say. Does anybody want to disagree with me on that? Demolish that claim?
I personally agree with you, and I had a wonderful time at the show, and it doesn't, at least for me, it doesn't diminish, the comments I made. I mean, as a musical, it's pretty amazing.
This is another thing academics do well, is to occupy multiple positions, conflicting positions simultaneously.
Don't put me in a box.
Absolutely fundamental to my strategy in any situation.
It's very K-fob, that I can say one thing and then also occupy another space. But just in general, that I really, really enjoyed it. It's very smart. And,
there's also a dimension of mimicry and embodiment in the fandom that I think has possibly a kind of power. When you get tons of sometimes very young, like 4-year-olds, as Phil was telling us about at lunch, bopping around to my shot. I don't know whether the 4-year-olds are quite old enough, but they'll grow into some sort of embodiment of some of the values in this music, maybe. But from all the way from 4-year-olds to people my age, having these songs and lines playing in their heads, whether they like it or not, which happened to me for about 12 months, that I would wake up with one or another song from Hamilton playing in my head, and just, if I was lucky, I could switch it to another song, another track, but I couldn't get rid of it. That there's a power in that. There's actually a potential for change in that kind of embodiment and emulation and replaying of these sounds and these ideas and these faces and bodies playing the roles that we really don't know how to talk about, and we don't know how to track it because nobody has ever tried to. But there might be something there that if we want to take the optimistic.
Yeah, well, and one really practical thing, I have a friend that wanted to audition for the touring thing, and she's like, oh, but I don't know how to rap. And I had a vision of everybody going to Carnegie Mellon now is going to have to take a class on rapping, and there is something, my music department, we don't have any classes that are not European music. We have a little bit of a jazz class, kind of, We don't do popular music. We don't do any world music or things like that. We're a very conservative department. That's very common in music departments. And I developed a hip hop course in this department. And everybody's I have to do so much for the legitimacy of that, as actual music for my colleagues, which I know probably seems crazy here, but in my school, that's a real thing. And so that's a real thing that Hamilton has done, is the music itself. And again, most people experience Hamilton just through the music. I don't know how many of you have even seen the show live. Probably not a lot of you. Some of you, yeah. But most millions of people have heard it just as an album.
And to respond to your question, I think that we can do a lot of good when we use the terms of money to rationalize why we should allocate resources to institutions that are doing some good work, like the University of California. But at the same time, like when we do that, we're still like complicit with the neoliberalization, right? Of accepting those terms. And sometimes it doesn't even work. So for instance, when I make arguments about the NEA should exist, because for every dollar put into it, it actually generates $8 more for restaurants, hotels, and the theater itself. And at the same time, we have an administration that wanted to get rid of it, even though it costs about $150 million. That's a couple of cents like per US citizen. So even when we use that economic rationality, sometimes it doesn't even work.
I'm not sure it ever works, actually.
So like, why not change the terms and be like, you know what, we should give citizenship to the 11 million undocumented people, because that's the right thing to do.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Because they're humans and we should be humane. End of list.
Right.
Yeah, you've convinced me. I think this would be a good time to open up to comments, questions from the audience. So Alex is going to...
And Susan has a mic too.
Okay, so when you have the mic, ask your question.
Hi, my name is Joyce. Yes, I did see the musical, and I became enamored of it. Had never heard of it before the announcement of the Tony nominations, and couldn't believe that a show had been nominated 17 times, and I had never heard of it, and I pay attention. I guess not. I guess my first question is, and appreciating what everybody has said, Donatella, your comments about Obama and his failures, and Mr. Gotanda, your disappointment is how I felt. You were disappointed by something, and you just wanted to enjoy the show. And I'm so with you on enjoying the show for what it was. When Lin Miranda wrote this show, he didn't know it was going to earn, I think, $500,000 per performance. He didn't know that. And so he didn't write it with the intention of having it garner this kind of criticism. You know, what he should have done, shoulda, woulda, coulda. His intention was just to have a good time creating a new kind of entertainment, which he did very successfully. And to compare this show to something mind-blowing and life-changing, I think it's unfair to him. Because when he wrote it, it wasn't his intention. And have we, because I certainly haven't seen it, have we done commentary, critical commentary on 1776 or The Lion in Winter, or I'm sure other people could name other Broadway performances, not performance, but productions that, or My Fair Lady, can we attack that in this way, the way Lin Miranda's production is being, I feel, attacked? I think it's one thing to question or present the good, what can come out of it. Certainly rap as a Broadway vehicle is very interesting, and he did it very successfully. And that's kind of like my take on it is, I want to defend him.
Thanks. Anyone want to take that up?
Oh, one more thing, the most important thing. I don't know if I said it. Is it really about the money? Is that why we're here criticizing him? Because he was successful and everybody else wasn't?
The question of intention, I think, is tricky. I guess I disagree. I think Miranda was trying to do something bigger than just a good show. I mean, Miranda he's super rooted in the Broadway tradition. You know, I think that's one of the good things about him is that he was an insider to Broadway. So he knows the Broadway, like how to sell a number and things like that. But I guess I do think that he was trying to go for something bigger than just a show to a certain extent. At least that's how it seemed. And I think a lot of us are also responding to the way that it's been talked about. You know, when you have like President Obama saying this musical is going to change the world. I think we're responding a little bit to that, the way that it has been lifted up in those sense, you know. So I think that's a little bit is responding to that discourse around it. Yeah, there's a great article about 1776 actually that just came out. So I recommend it. Alyssa Harbert, it's really great. You know, it got performed at the Nixon White House, and Nixon made them cut numbers from it that he didn't like politically. Wow. So it's fascinating actually. But thanks. I filled this one. All right.
Did you get that one?
Hello. Hi. I had a question for Phil. First off, thank you for addressing the question of identity politics in Hamilton.
Phil.
Oh, Phil.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Especially in the hurricane, as you mentioned, identity politics is an important discussion to have. You mentioned earlier that identity politics is an incredibly effective tool, but when you describe the moments that called out to you in Hamilton, the death of Philip Schuyler, the forgiveness moment, those moments are arguably the most apolitical in the entire show when it discards politics altogether. Is that a failure of Hamilton to adequately channel some substantiveness of identity politics, or a shortcoming of identity politics itself?
That's a great question. I suspect others might be able to address that too. It's for me, those are the best moments of the show, actually, for me. And this is probably just like a personal aesthetic thing that I always prefer stuff that makes you feel something rather than something that tells me what to think. So I get less interested in didactic political work that was like, here's the thing that we should be doing, and I'd rather have it be embodied in some way. And so, but that is for me, the identity politics of it is like being able to put yourself in the shoes of these historical figures as if you belong to this country is an interesting kind of identity politics. And I think it's right, though, the question is then how do you mobilize those feelings into something besides just yourself, into a collective action? And that's sometimes been identity politics struggle a little bit. Not always, often it's really successful, but sometimes it's like how do you take your feelings and then make it something collective with a lot of people that can do something, you know?
I think that you really can't separate sort of apolitical and political moments. It only works if there's a continuum in which there is character moving, narrative moving, so that when you do feel something, if it's done appropriately, you've also brought with it all the political, historical elements to it, and that you can feel it as a human moment. So if they are in fact feeling separate, then the work is not successful. But if it's working appropriately, then you should be able to feel in that moment that's quiet, also all the history resonating and all the politics resonating in it, if the character and story and the emotion are served.
I'm actually with you, and I feel like, can we get back to politics, please? Yo.
We have a question back here. Thank you for all of that. I wanted, when this panel and the sort of informational thing, it was partly about the status of Hamilton now and how it exists now that Obama's not in the White House, in addition to just sort of the White House. And we've talked a lot about Hamilton in the abstract, right? This is picking up on what Marianne said about, what it says or what it does. And I'm wondering if we could maybe talk a little bit about where Hamilton exists physically right now, a little bit inspired by Donatella's point about the re-entrenchment of liberals and sort of claiming this now, because Hamilton's touring, right? And so I'm a little bit interested in this idea about it possibly reenacting a little bit of the fracture that people imagined, at least initially, that the election sort of showed, coastal elites versus the rest of everybody else. So I'm wondering if maybe you could all talk a little bit about where Hamilton is right now and where it's moving and how that might be shaping some of its meanings in this sort of post-Obama, still Obama-ish time. Thank you.
That's good. I mean, if I think of a tangible thing, I find it so fascinating that every big arts place in the country is using this. You have to subscribe to a season somewhere to go to Hamilton the next year. I don't know, which is, I guess, good, yeah.
Which points to a slightly larger question also about what Hamilton is doing for musical theater in general. But I don't want to deflect into that if somebody wants to talk about the geography and the sort of regional question that I think was at the center of that. My answer is I don't know where it is. I know where the satellite productions have been, but in terms of the actual touring company, I don't know what the itinerary is or how one might parse that in terms of like the electoral map of 2016, which I take to be the point of the question.
Well, building a little bit on what you had just said, so you would, in order to see it in a regional production, often you need to buy not only the ticket to that show, but to the whole season, which costs a lot of money. So obviously that delimits access to going to the theater. And then second, I don't know the whole itinerary of the national tour, but I know it was in the Bay Area. It's, I think, currently at Hollywood Pantages, so a lot of my students are seeing it. And then it has a permanent production in Chicago. And so it's not surprising to me that, of course, it's going to go around to cities. There's a particular circuit and infrastructure already built for this. And we know that cities lean more blue than other places. So it's like preaching to the choir probably largely. But related to what you're saying about social movements and music, I'm not dismissive of that. I think it's really useful actually to be energized by that. And I know it has been like life-changing and affirming for a lot of people to see themselves reflected on stage.
One little anecdote, I teach in Delaware, which has a really rural part that does not feel like a coastal elite, and I was teaching middle school band camp, as you do, and none of them knew Hamilton except for one 12-year-old girl who was African-American, and she was the only African-American girl in the room, and Hamilton was so meaningful for her. And she was from like southern, slower Delaware, we call it. It's from the rural part of the state, and Hamilton was a lifeline for her, as Broadway musicals often are for people that don't live in cities. I certainly remember when I heard Rent for the first time as a kid, and it was very meaningful. Yeah.
Do you want to take one more question, then people can ask their questions in the reception if they have more?
Perfect.
You have one?
So my question is actually about diversity. I love Hamilton, but I also think that like you can't fully enjoy something unless you can critique it. So Hamilton is, the American musical, and a lot of people have very strong opinions about the diversity of the casting, but also when we think about racism in America, to a lot of white people especially, when we're talking about racism, a diverse cast is the inclusion of, for example, one black male in a TV series or something like that. And a lot of the cast of Hamilton is African American. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but also like Philippa Sue is the only Asian American actress in the production, in the original Broadway production that I can think of. And then Lin-Manuel, of course, being from Puerto Rico. But do you think that the inclusion of a lot of black actors and actresses and very little of other backgrounds is kind of symbolic of America and, continuing racism even as we strive for more diversity?
So I'll speak to how the U.S. largely exists in a black-white binary, right, of considering white folks and black folks as Americans because of genocide, dispossession, and erasure of indigenous folks, and then the immigration and deemed aliens of Asian and Latinx people. I mean, the word like alien, and the first time that we excluded people on the basis of race was the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. So that's certainly the case. It's something also important that Philippa Sue is mixed Asian and white, and she's like the faithful, like butterfly wife, which is annoying to me, but also like I love seeing her and have this very ambivalent relationship to watching her on stage. Second, I'd point out statistics about how 80% of roles on Broadway and off-Broadway go to white people. About 12 to 14% are for black folks, which is comparable to this nation's demographics, but not the demographics of New York City. Asian American actors get 1 to 2% of the roles, and Latinx actors get about 2 to 4% of the roles. So those numbers for Asian Americans, which represent 5 to 6% of the nation, and more like 13% of New York City, and for Latinx folks who are widely underrepresented on Broadway, and then that's reflected in the cast of Hamilton. So that is not surprising to me at all.
Anyone want to add anything to that? It's,
I was just thinking, I happen to know Oscar Eustace, who runs the Public Theater, and it's sort of interesting that Oscar is originally from Minnesota, but he spent a lot of his formative theater years here in the Bay Area, and he is one of the prime movers of Angels in America, and then he moved over first to the Taper and then to the Public, but it is interesting to kind of track certain artistic directors who have a certain kind of political point of view and how it translates in terms of how and what they produce. And I just know that, Oscar, it makes sense that this would come out of the Public. And it has a lot to do, again, with the people behind the scene who are willing to produce it. And it can also kind of look and understand where art and politics at times can kind of intersect. And that certainly is the case with Oscar, Mr. Eustace.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, so it's the Asian American Performers Action Coalition, which is the only group that has done any statistics whatsoever on race and ethnicity in casting. And they pointed out that the Public Theater is the best theater of all the professional theaters in New York City when it comes to casting people of color.
Thanks very much first of all, to the audience for excellent attention and excellent questions, and to all of the three of you for your wonderful remarks and generosity this afternoon. I think we do have a reception outside, so we can continue conversation out there. Thanks so much.
Very nice. That was great.